This is a forgery. For the real thing, come to the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago.
Good morning. Monday morning, 10 in the morning here in Chicago. Welcome to virtual book signing. As always, we're here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, and we appreciate any of you who have actually skipped work just to watch us. We appreciate that. If you're watching the archive, there will be books available for you, we hope. The first edition signed. That's how you're able to get a great library together of first edition books with wonderful authors whom you can then go back to our archives and watch and show other people as well. Meanwhile, we are very happy to have what I consider an overachiever. I think he can stop at this point. I was looking at his bio, my lord. I think it's time to go fishing for a little while, perhaps, but we love what he does. Edward J. Larson, University Professor, and Hugh and Hazel Darling Chair in Law at Pepperdine University. He teaches, lectures, and writes about issues of law, politics, science, and medicine from an historical perspective. That's us, you know. He is the inaugural Library Fellow at the newly opened George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. He's the author of 9 books and nearly 100 published articles. His books include, just a few, A Magnificent Catastrophe, The Tumultuous Election of 1800, America's First Presidential Campaign, came out in 2008. Before that, Evolution, The Remarkable History of a Scientific Theory. Also Sex, Race, and Science, Eugenics in the Deep South. And Trial and Error, The American Controversy Over Creation and Evolution. There were expanded editions. First came out in 1985 and expanded in 2002. And also An Empire of Ice, Scott, Shackleton, and the Heroic Age of Anarchic Science, that came out in 2011 and was the winning Summer for the Gods, the Scopes and Trial, and America's continuing debate over science and religion, which did win Mr. Larson the Pulitzer Prize. So today we have his latest book, The Return of George Washington, 1783 to 1984. We're in 1800s shop, you know, so it's hard to get into the 21st century. The Return of George Washington, 1783 to 94. No, I'm wrong.
89.
89, thank you. I'm looking at it. I had the wrong date in. William Morrow, 400 pages and illustrated, $29.95. Now, you mentioned, before I get you started on this, you mentioned 3 other Pulitzer winners who seem to overlook this aspect of Washington's life. Said something about it and moved on. So does it take a Pulitzer winner to plug the holes of 3 other Pulitzer winners?
Well, there have been 3 great, truly great Pulitzer Prize winning books about Washington. There have been some others that focused on narrow areas like Washington's Crossing, a brilliant Pulitzer Prize winning book by David Hacker Fisher. But when we're thinking about the long biographies, Ron Chernow's was the last, a superb biography, and then you get the multi-volume ones before that. And in those, they cover the entire Washington, and what I think they're doing, none of them are lawyers, none of them are attuned to constitutional issues. Mm-hmm. And they just have covered the intensity of the Revolutionary War, which was, of course, Washington's center stage, the great commander, back and forth, a little bit like what Lincoln faced in the Civil War, as some surprising defeats and some problems, but then pulling it all together in the end with Yorktown after turning the tide in some earlier battles. Mm-hmm. So you had that intensity, and you're focused deep, and it's very intense. And then you have his presidency, which is a focus of attention. Many books just about his presidency, but also covered beautifully by the large biographies. Then you get this in-between period when you have 5 years, starting with Yorktown, or you could say starting with the reconquest of the liberation, as it were, of New York City. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in that period, I start with, frankly, with the Newburgh conspiracy and at Newburgh, and then through the time he's sworn in as president. And so these books tend during this period to sort of catch their breath. They need some to let up a little bit on the intensity. And so they talk a lot about Washington as a farmer. Now, Washington was a farmer, and that was very important. He introduced some methods of scientific farming, and he rebuilt his plantation, and I cover that. But what they don't really focus on is how intensely involved Washington was with this period, with building the nation. He had become convinced. He was America's great nationalist then. He had become not just a Virginian, but an American during the Revolutionary War. And he is distraught by the breakdown of the nation, as it were, of the Union that actually began with Yorktown, was featured in the late period of when he was still commander-in-chief. So he wrote the circular letter to the states where he's tried to say, you've got to pull together. And so he becomes the behind the scenes, but also somewhat in front of the scenes, actor who's trying to change, radical cures as he calls it, change the Confederation and make it into a nation. And so I tell that story in addition to all the other adventures like his trip west and his farming.
Oh yes, you bring in a bunch else in, but you do keep focus, which is the reason for the book. I'm going to go around this whole thing a number of times. I first want to begin, though, and ask you about teaching American history, because you mentioned in there that you went to Australia, and in the process of teaching non-American students, you reconceived your approach to American history and maybe even your views on the teaching of history.
I had the good fortune to be invited to teach American legal history, so that's probably suggests the legal aspect at the University of Melbourne, which they at least consider the finest university in the Southern Hemisphere. And they had excellent students, many actually, a few from America, but many from places like New Zealand and England, but mostly from Australia. And there they are similar to the United States in that they have somewhat of a confederation government. There is actual power in the various states of Australia, and they have a number of states, and they have a Senate somewhat like ours with equal representation from even the little states. And so they face some of the tensions of keeping the country together and pulling apart. And they're very interested in the issues of what does the Bill of Rights mean? How does the American Constitution work versus theirs? Because they still had the Queen as their titular monarch, appointing a Governor General. So they're very interested in constitutional issues. So I was teaching this period, focusing on the Constitution building, and I had earlier written a book with one of my colleagues at the University of Georgia, Michael Winship, where we took Madison's notes to the Constitutional Convention and added all the other notes and letters and put it into one narrative history. So you could be reading Madison's notes of what Franklin said, or what Gouverneur Morris said, or what Robert Wilson said, or Hamilton, but it reads put together sort of like a Shakespeare play. And Madison's notes are almost unreadable, and by doing in their original form, they're just hard to understand as a narrative, and this makes it more narrative. And that I used that book over there, and from teaching it, trying to make it relate to the eyes of people who are living in a different sort of confederation with different sort of tensions and different sort of issues of what should be national and what should be state. It made me rethink of what it was like under the Articles of Confederation. And they were very interested in that in the transition period. And then I began to rethink that and rethink Washington's role. And then I worked with others to try to refigure. But it made me, because I was teaching to students who were interested in the same issues of union versus states' rights, as we'd say, and the tensions involved in a different way, helped me and different ideas of where does liberty lie? Does liberty lie in the national level or the state level? An issue, of course, was Lincoln's main question. I mean, one of the driving forces in the Civil War. Made me rethink of what they were thinking about it back then, and that, in a way, got me thinking about this book and had me rethinking.
Just briefly, a question came up when we were talking about Flexner and Freeman.
Right.
The two of them both wrote multi-volumes, as you mentioned. Freeman had 7 volumes and Flexner 4. Each of them had a 1-volume condensation.
Right.
Freeman, it was done by Richard Harwell after Freeman's death. Flexner did it by himself, for himself. Personally, I'd like to get just a brief view. I feel that Harwell did a better job of condensation than perhaps the author can do on his own book, Flexner, because he just knew too much.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. Because though I like Flexner's, actually like the way he condensed his four, and I like the way he condensed it, I do think the other works better as a single volume book. They had the two of them, they did bring out different issues. You'd think, why was Flexner spending all this time so soon after the magnificent Freeman volume came out? And yet Flexner did, because he was more attuned as a popularizer in a certain way, he did bring out different aspects, and it did resonate better for his period. But it is tough to digest into a single volume. The best thing about the Flexner, in all honesty, I think, is the name, The Indispensable Man. What a brilliant name for a single volume. It does capture something, but the title is probably, I actually like reading the individual volumes with Flexner better.
I do too. And we'll get to that indispensable part in a moment. Behind me here, we have John Rogers' group that came out in the 1860s. It's not a group, of course, but they're known as groupings. And here is George Washington. Rogers himself wrote how he spent hours and hours on the face to try to get it exactly as it should be, and looking at all the images that there were. He had no photographs, of course. Now, here we are at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and Lincoln is such a vibrant, live person. You see him in the newspaper just about every week. Washington, not so much. And perhaps is he just too old and cold for most people at this point? Do we take him for granted because he's more like granite?
Well, I think the reason why I spent so much time on the face is you do have a problem with Washington's face. We have the great good fortune of having a life mask made by the best person in that category. Comes over from France, makes a magnificent life mask. And so, which was during the period I write about, actually. It was made during that period. And a bust was made on the spot, and it is still owned by Mount Vernon. You can see it. Washington kept it in his own office, and now it's, of course, in the educational center there at Mount Vernon. And it actually gives us an image, because what gets confused is you later have, as everyone knows from the $1 bill, the Gilbert Stuart, which was much later. I think it was 95. And the false teeth are so prominent below the jaw that and sticking out so much, and makes him almost look like a chipmunk in the way his mouth pushes out. I'm not a big fan of that picture. I prefer the way the Peels drew him. Of course, the most paintings, Peel did the most paintings. Charles Wilson Peel did the most paintings of Washington from life, and then he made so many copies of him. He superimposed them on every battlefield. It was the same picture, but it was superimposed on whatever battlefield you needed, Princeton or whatever. But because of the prominence of Gilbert Stuart, it makes the face particularly hard to do. And Washington had a very distinguished face. I mean, he was considered in his youth a heartthrob. I mean, he was an incredibly dignified, handsome man, tall for his age, at 6'2", making him like Lincoln, who was tall for his age. But Lincoln was wiry, and Washington was built like an oak tree, and he had big hips. He was a magnificent horseman, and he often rode on those huge horses. So he had this powerful image, and he wasn't a speaker like Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, was the great wordsmith, beautiful speaker. Washington wasn't so much a speaker; he was a good letter writer, but he wasn't a great speaker. And so you get it, and I like the fact that his mouth is closed, which he would always keep his mouth closed because the teeth were so bad, and and then I also like that he is smart enough to put it with a bicorn, the hat coming out both ways, sort of like we think of as an admiral's hat, because so many made him with a tricorn, and he didn't wear tricorns; he wore bicorns. So I think it's a great job. He cared a lot about it. It shows his big hips. It shows him standing up, and he liked to stand. He wasn't like Lincoln. It seemed appropriate to have him sitting, but it seems appropriate to have Washington standing tall, standing wide. He almost gets a group portrait out of one person.